Hello, everyone. It's 7:05. Hopefully, people will be trickling in. Actually, man, can you get me some more tea? So just some hot water. Just some hot water. No. Just some hot water. Yeah, thanks, man. That's my friend Christian Greer. He'll be helping tonight. Welcome to How to Navigate the Weirdness. I want to just say right up front that I have no fucking idea. So it's a lure. It's a lure, but we'll work it out. We'll come up with some practices and tools and techniques together, hopefully. So my friend Christian, together. Oh yeah, how many people have never been to the Alembic before? Let's see. Okay, if you have, welcome to the Alembic. We do this kind of weird programming sometimes. We do meditation classes, movement classes, mystic arts. We throw parties on occasion, do music on occasion. And so I think it's a pretty interesting place, doing some pretty interesting programming. So if you're at all intrigued, I encourage you to sign up for the mailing list. It's just once a week. It's short. You can see the kind of crazy stuff we do. And if you don't like it, you can just delete it, go away. But I'll just throw that out there. And we'll be hearing a little more about some events coming up later tonight. So I'm going to introduce my friend Christian Greer. He and I and our friend Maria Mangini co-host an event called The Chalice, which is a monthly psychedelic salon held on the first Wednesday of the month. And we usually have guests, but sometimes we tell stories, we have debates, we have breakout groups on occasion, and it's just it's kind of a counterbalance to a lot of the psychedelic discourse these days. We're sort of more old school. We like having elders come and tell their underground tales. We're into like poetry and jokes and gods and demons and like not quite the medicalized sort of VC funded sort of side of psychedelics these days, which is in addition to being significant and transformative, kind of boring. So we're trying to not be boring. Anyway, so in addition to that, Christian is a professor. He and I taught a class together, and I was already impressed with him as a speaker. We won't be hearing from him much tonight, but a little bit, hopefully. Usually it's hard to keep him down, so we'll see. Maybe we'll get a Mutt and Jeff thing going here, and then, but in addition to being a great speaker, he's amazing at the chalkboard, or in this case, the whiteboard. And so I invited him to whiteboard this. I know some of you have probably been at conferences where they have somebody who's doing whatever, and he's going to do his version of that. And it was a really great relief for me because the kind of stuff I do, it doesn't really work making a slideshow, like a PowerPoint. It's just not my style. I've never really made PowerPoints. But I'm not very good at the whiteboard. So I go all over the place and people are like, wow, this is fun. This is so cool. And then we're like, what was that about? I don't know. So it frees me up. There'll be a little bit of a trace of where we're going. So where are we going? I want to start with a place that I found myself in this weekend. For whatever reason, I'm one of those people who kind of engage politics by following, well, as the podcast has it, know your enemy. So I spent a lot of time studying the right, and I went down a couple of rabbit holes. And as one does, sort of like chaining emails, and there's a reference over here, and I'm going to open up a thing, and I'm pretty good. I've been researching for decades, so I'm pretty good at like quality control and finding good sources, but it's still a lot going from point to point to point to point. And then at some point, I was looking at a video from the ARC, which was a recent sort of conservative, sort of like like they want to get the alt-right going in the UK, and they had this conference. So it was a lot of kind of Christian conservatives with a UK twist. And they had a talk by Eric Weinstein, who's kind of an intellectual dark web guy, not a Christian, but sort of interesting guy, but also kind of creepy and weird. He's an interesting character. I've heard him speak before, and he's usually pretty level-headed. And then I'm like watching this talk, and it kind of starts out about this, and he makes a point I'll get to later about how we're coming to the end of what he called a 70-year nap, and I'll explain what he meant by that in a second. And so we're going along, there's some big changes, and throws in some hatred of kind of woke stuff and whatever. And then somehow, by the end of the 17 minutes, we were at a kind of conspiratorial dampening of the real physics breakthroughs that lie just around the corner, that have been tamped down by some unnamed forces that have been misdirecting us towards quantum gravity, turning us away from the real good stuff, the end of physics, which is what we need, because if we don't get the end of physics, we're not going to get off the planet, and we are on a course towards war, and we better get off the planet before that happens, or that's it. So, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, like smeared across these like different narratives that have somehow like weirdly combined in this kind of charismatic, kind of crazy way that maybe it's got a lot of attention. I can't tell. It came up on the algorithm. Is this even an idea? What is he talking? Should I research this? And I was just like, and I'd been doing this for hours, so I was just kind of smeared. And that's one of the places where we are, if we're thinking people, if we're trying to understand what's going on, is that we're just like smeared across all of these narratives and claims, and you can almost feel the kind of hooks of the algorithm like yanking you this way and that way, and how like the hype around something is like ahead of what the content is, and it's just, it's a kind of maddening situation. And so what I'm trying to do here is to just, I don't know anything about what to do politically. I'm not talking about that scale of things. When I talk about how to navigate the weirdness, I'm concerned for my and your mental health. And I mean that really seriously. I'm concerned that we start to fragment and freak out in very concrete ways. And so my response is, most of the practices, even though I'm going to present a lot of heady stuff, the practices that I'm going to emphasize, I would like to think of, are actually rather pragmatic. They're not answers in an ideological sense. They're more like tools and techniques to help you along your way. They've worked for me. They might work for you. So what I'm going to be doing tonight is beginning a kind of historical arc. I'm going to talk a little bit about history in general, thinking through history in a moment. But I'm going to start with a historical arc of this, what Eric Weinstein called a 70-year nap, which is really more of a 75 to 80-year nap. And what he means is something was put together at the end of World War II. Let's call it the post-war order. And that order, in some ways, worked really well. It certainly achieved some of the things that it wanted to do. And that order we are now at the endpoint of, or at least the radical transformation deconstruction of. And so I want to kind of sketch that story as a way to put the weirdness in some kind of historical frame. Because for me, that's one of the practices. One of the practices is to understand, is to think historically about things. It doesn't mean that now I know the facts about how we got here. It means actively cultivating a sense of rigorous and grounded narratives that help frame and contextualize the situation that we're in. And one of the reasons to do that is because it actually lets you a little bit off the hook. Not so much like it's your fault, but more that, what the fuck is happening? And you're like, well, actually, there's a lot of reasons that things have happened this way. Let's just look at the history of technology. Let's just look at the history of digital technology. Let's think about when social media appeared. Let's go back to the whatever. There's all of these stories in the environment, in the history of parliamentary politics, in the history of religion, and the history of psychedelics. Like, there are all of these ways to kind of understand how these currents have moved and changed and brought us to this moment. And I find it to be a relatively grounding practice. It's not an entirely grounding practice because it's not really ultimately there. It's kind of a story. I'm building it just like everybody else is building it. It's not like, oh, now I found the foundation of the actual story of why we're here. No. Those kinds of thinkers I'm not interested in. What I'm interested in is building over many decades now a kind of larger meta-narrative about kind of why we are where we're at, and to constantly work on that both in a rigorous way and in a speculative way. Because one of the ways that I approach history, and this is, you will know this if you've read some of my bigger books like Technosis or High Weirdness, but some of the other work I do as well, which is that while on the one hand, I like to stick to concrete what we know, I have a academic background, and I appreciate academic approaches and scholarly questions and the kind of skepticism that scholars bring to historical accounts, particularly conspiracy accounts. At the same time, there's something weird about history. There's something weird about time. There's something weird about studying history and time, which is that it kind of throws up strange patterns, synchronicities, odd figures, echoes, strange things that resonate with you in ways as if you were too familiar with them. Like it's not just a concrete historical text. It's also a dream text. And I'm trying to sort of work with both of those as a way to get a handle on the weirdness. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the beginnings of this 75-year nap, and then go to the 1970s, which is the period that I worked on for High Weirdness. Go over some of that material about why I think that period is so important, because I think it sets up our moment very significantly, just the way that the beginning of this period of time after World War II set us up. And then I'm going to look at some of the characters I talked about in High Weirdness, particularly Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson, and pull from them a couple of practices, a couple of navigating the weird practices, and we'll see, where we go from there. And then the second half will be Q&A, so I'm happy to talk about it anyway. Just the way I like to do these things. We are now on the internet. Hello, internet. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be all together for the first half where I'm giving the talk, but then when we go on Q&A, bye-bye internet, so it's just us in the room. That I like the way that works, and it feels more kind of intimate.
So how does this look for you? How to navigate the weirdness, techniques, tools for staying grounded, and then you move from meta-narrative, narrative, how to get a handle on weirdness, telling stories?
Yeah.
Is that about right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. So let's start with.
Yeah, dark colors only.
Yeah, sorry about the lighting. It's just I'm just going to apologize. I'm not going to, it's a little silly. But so I want to start with one of these weird symbols that pop up in a kind of like uncanny way across the transom, and it seems like it was 1,000,000 years ago, but it was this, right? We had two of those in a pretty short period of time. So there we are on our feeds, dealing not with a concept or a set of words or a claim or the development of some new thing, but with a gesture, a very powerful gesture indeed. And then the chattering classes to and then that, again, it was one of those uncanny moments where I'm sitting there, I'm going, I'm reading a justification of this gesture. Like, how is that possible? Like, how did we get here? And it's one of those loopy moments that now more and more is part of our experience, the sense of the rug being pulled out from under us, the sense of vertigo, of creepy uncanniness. And I want to suggest that there's actually another way of thinking about that rather than the obvious narratives around the return of truly virulent racism, which is that it has to do with World War II. That we are waking up from this period of time that was constructed very cleverly, and as I said, fairly effectively after World War II. So World War II is a fucking nightmare, right? It's just like impossible to imagine the horror of this thing. And as the Allies emerged from this, one of the ways of looking at what they were doing was like, okay, and this is giving them some credit, right? This is giving them some credit. This is not like a critical left-wing account of, no, it's just like they came out, they're like, let's not do that. Whatever we do, let's try to build a post-war order that we don't have a world destructive order of war in Europe. Let's try to not do that. And so let's construct a more multicultural world, a world based on trade and interchange between different cultures. And we're going to construct a sort of era of and it's really building what would become the kind of neoliberal order. And they did a pretty good job, right? They in a way, they blew it in the end, I would say, because there were opportunities to make it much less greed driven, but I'm not even going to get there. I'm just going to say that there's something that begins in the early 1940s that is incredibly significant to our story because it's kind of like the beginning of our technological era. So there's two main technologies that I want to point to from this zone. One is just the bomb. You know, suddenly we have this apocalyptic, world-destroying power that already adds a dark dream text, a sort of nightmarish frame around everything that we do. But it also has a very specific effect on the United States of America. There's Gary Wills wrote a really good book called Bomb Power, and it's basically about how just the existence of the bomb totally transforms the nature of the presidency because it becomes, in a way, suddenly much more important because they have the finger on the button. And they are also involved, deeply bound up with a deep, secret, kind of fucked up national security state. So we enter into a realm not only of this sort of visible construction of a post-war order of liberal financial exchanges and consumer on a global level, but also the existence of a really powerful and really deep national security state and all the associated ideas there. The other main sort of technological development is much more broad and general, which is cybernetics. Cybernetics really emerges from World War II. And interestingly, it kind of emerges actually from technological practices, which kind of precede the articulation of cybernetics as a theory of control and communication, which is what happens in the late 1940s. And, you know, I could talk a week about cybernetics and its relationship to systems theory over here and ecology over there and artificial intelligence over there. It's a vast, rich, and incredibly important topic because what cybernetics is something that changes over time and it changes its name. So it's kind of hard to almost to track. But to put it in a nutshell, it's basically the idea of technologizing and analytically understanding a feedback loop or recursion, how a system produces an effect that gets fed back into the system as a way to understand learning, change, responsiveness to the environment. And this basic model of a kind of feedback loop helps from a cybernetic perspective to understand how humans learn, how machines learn, and how environments or ecologies operate. So suddenly these very different situations, early forms of robots and machine learning, human beings with their consciousness and culture and education, and environments and ecologies, all of them suddenly reflect something about systems and about feedback loops and recursion. So it becomes a kind of master language that really shapes the emergence of the post-war order in a way that is both kind of liberating and experimental, and also kind of creepy and a little bit mind controlling. Two really great books about this period that I really highly recommend. One is The Democratic Surround by Fred Turner, who also wrote a terrific book From Counterculture to Cyberspace or Cyberculture. And it talks about the emergence, the use of new media technologies in this post-war era to inculcate a certain pluralism and openness to otherness, very specifically driven by, again, this desire to keep fascism at bay. So it's a little bit conspiratorial, but it's kind of on the right side. So it's an interesting mix. Similarly is the Benjamin Breen book, Tripping on Utopia. And we had Ben come here, gave a terrific presentation at the Chalice, and he talks about the role that psychedelics played in a similar moment. So there's stuff about cybernetics, there's stuff about social ecology, and it's all about ways of understanding society and human consciousness in the cybernetic fashion as a way of steering it. So a very concrete way of understanding cybernetics today is basically like a recommendation algorithm, or the way that artificial intelligence learns about us and spits back things that we want to consume. It's just a very simple example of how actions that we do on the internet go into an organization or a device an algorithm that's focused on us, and it produces a change based on our earlier behavior. And we have these kind of feedback loops, which of course can be incredibly oppressive, but they can also be very useful. So we're inside of a cybernetic situation that we can't get out of. Like, we are absolutely immersed in this insane multidimensional cybernetic experiment that's been going on for 75 years. And that's where we all operate, even the captains of industry. So those things are going on. So just to throw out some dates to give us a little sense of like the kind of significant events that are happening at this beginning of this 70-year nap, 75-year nap. You have the first atomic bomb in 1945. In 1946, you have the first Macy Conference, which was an early gathering of cybernetics folks. So these are technologists, they're cultural anthropologists, they're psychologists, they're business people. It's that whole kind of elite network, technocratic network. How do we use these new technologies to shape society? We have the public unveiling of the ENIAC, the first electronic computer, which was work vastly faster than all of the earlier vacuum tube computers. I think in a few years they had estimated it had done more calculations than had been done in human history up to that point. In 1947, we have the founding of the CIA out of the OSS, and in 1948, Norbert Wiener writes his famous book on cybernetics. So this is the kind of like, in a way, it's like setting the ground or shaping the foundation for this post-war order. So far I've been speaking in fairly concrete, historical, technological, political sense, right? Well, let me just throw out some other dates. Kind of interesting. A little weirder, right? So what else happened in 1947? Anybody? Well, Kenneth Arnold saw the first flying saucer in the summer of 1947. Sandoz released its public formulation of LSD-25 called Delicid in 1947. Right around there, and then this is one of my kind of favorite ones. In 1945, there was the discovery of the Nag Hammadi scriptures. Now, you're like, well, one of these things doesn't really belong. You're talking about bombs and computers and the CIA, and then you're talking about like a bunch of old Gnostic texts found in a jar in Upper Egypt. Like, no, what are you talking about? Well, from certain angles, that's as significant and as symptomatic as well as significant as any of these events. By symptomatic, I mean that it's telling you something about what's going on at this period in time. And that's where the way that I'm approaching history steps away from a traditional academic approach to history and enters something a little bit more like a dream text. Because what my approach to history is that even as you look for what actually happened and you want records, you want to get into the archives, you want to find real good historians who are not full of shit, who don't have an agenda. At the same time, as you do this work, inevitably, you start seeing these curious sort of synchronicities, symbols, odd things that don't really quite fit, that seem to point to some other level of meaning. They pop up like they have some extra significance for you. And that part of the work, in my mind, of understanding both history and also where we are is to be open to those synchronicities, those hints, those resonances, but also not falling into the rabbit holes that they open up. And that kind of one step forward, one step back, or kind of dance has a lot to do with the kind of practices I'm talking about how to navigate weirdness, and we'll talk more about that. Getting back to the Nag Hammadi discoveries, they were, for example, extremely important to Philip K. Dick. In his novel Valis, Dick puts out the idea that the living spirit, the spirit of God, was moving through physical people, like almost like in a genetic virus. And then until 70 AD, when the Romans attacked Jerusalem and real time ceased. And that all time between now and 1945 is an illusion. And in 1945, when the Nag Hammadi texts are rediscovered, they the virus is physically released from the texts themselves, and they begin to enter into people, and they turn them into what he called homoplasmates, and the spirit was alive again, and then we're back into this kind of religious narrative. So completely bonkers stuff. That nonetheless, if you've read Philip K. Dick, you know that he has a strange way of getting under your skin. It kind of resonates. Again, it's like waking up from a dream. It's like, oh, that was a really weird dream. It's kind of staying with me. It's kind of creepy, kind of beautiful. I'm not really sure. And so I include that as a significant sort of historical event, as a way to gesture towards this sort of mystical night side of historical research, as well as to point to something else that starts happening in the 1940s that totally transforms by now, which is just the emergence and availability of incredibly powerful and fascinating esoteric, mystical, and religious texts. Things about ultimate ends and beginnings, about the true nature of the soul, about how to achieve higher consciousness. This immense archive of mostly esoteric literature that eventually, within even just a few decades, starts to become more available and is now, of course, as available as everything else. So that, in a way, is like setting up this kind of transformative story. And as we'll see, I will take this into our present day more in the second episode next week. So what I want to do now is to shift into a little story about the 1960s and particularly the 1970s. So I'm going to move into high weirdness territory. So all these things are already in motion. There we go. That was beautiful. Well timed. Well timed. Again, you got the UFO story, this kind of new religion that seems to point to something else, and it gets bigger and bigger. And it's in popular culture, it's moving along. You have psychedelics like slipping out of the hands of psychiatrists and starting to move through the world and like go into the avant-garde and the underground. You have the CIA doing all of their nefarious CIA things, including using psychedelics to do mind control tests on people. Moving forward, you have the computer changing. You have all these streams of transformation happening. And then we have this kind of explosion of novelty and consciousness release and radical politics in the 1960s, and particularly the 1970s. I'm not going to talk much about the 1960s. We all have a pretty good idea of it in our heads, even if they're all a little bit different. But one thing we don't often do, and one thing I did really underline in High Weirdness, is to differentiate between the 1960s and the 1970s. And to say that really, in a lot of ways, it's the 1970s that are really the important decade. And so I'm going to do another one of these kind of, acute generalization of some of the shifts that happen. So 1960s, the revolution's going to happen, or transformation's going to happen. The new consciousness is just around the corner. I mean, one of the hardest things to communicate about an era and time, that, especially when you've lived through, is how it felt that there was about to be an enormous change right on the horizon. So like you went through Y2K, you were like, oh my God, Y2K. Now you look at it and you go, what the fuck was good about? Some people say it's actually because we got our smarts together and actually avoided a problem that would have happened, but I can't speak to that. But it was certainly the case that in the 1960s, whether you were a radical politico or whether you were a full-on, mystic acid head, that it really felt like a big, big old change was just around the corner, and it didn't happen. And what happened instead was the 70s. But in a lot of ways, it's the way in which the 70s integrated and transformed elements from the explosion of culture and consciousness that was the 1960s that actually really changed, at least in America, the nature of things. So on the simple level, that it's in the 70s that you can find LSD everywhere, that people loosen up their sexual mores considerably everywhere. It's not just located in a few areas where the sort of heads live. It's like pervasive throughout the society. And a number of really interesting things happen in the 1970s. From a personal point of view, in a weird way, people were let loose from their established narratives, that the 60s kind of blew up traditional narratives about what's the point of human life, what are you doing, who are you, and it it created a space for a kind of a sense of reinvention that was also, people often call themselves seekers in this time. That was also a bit existentially harrowing. You had a lot of people who went through these enormous experiences in the 1960s, and then they kind of come out on the other end going like, what are we doing now? And and it's no accident that in this period of time is when you see the rise of a lot of what we call cults, or sort of very disciplined religious organizations, because people were so blown out they didn't know what to do. So it becomes a time when like the self is like a project. Like, what am I becoming? Who am I? Is it est? Is it Jesus freaks? Is it acid? I don't know. It's like this kind of a zone of incredible searching. And that's one way of kind of understanding it from the sort of inside. But this shift has distinct connections in what's happening with the economy and what's happening with technology. What do I mean by that? It's in the early 1970s that the whole economy starts to shift towards consumer debt and consumer desire. So there's a connection between the proliferation of new kinds of ways of being in the world, new lifestyles, new desires, a truly pluralist society, which in some ways is the society that all the right-wingers are rejecting at this point, where you start to honor that there are lesbians who want to have their own way of living, that there are people of color who want to have their own way of living, that some people want to go out and start rural communes, that some people want to get into computers. You have this sense of a pluralistic world of desire that capitalism's ready to kind of play with. Like, oh yeah, we can work with this. We can develop and reflect and feed back your desires and your searching through the mechanism of capitalism. And we're going to do it partly by moving things towards the consumer. So it starts to sort of reflect and feed back. It both proliferates and changes and gets kind of fed back in this very sort of interesting way. Simultaneously, other things happen in the economy that are really significant. So in 1971, Nixon takes this off the gold standard. So there's no longer a direct link between gold and the value of the dollar, thereby releasing the forces of what we now call financialization. So suddenly there's a decoupling, and money becomes this more abstract and more potentially manipulable abstraction that sets in motion a lot of the transformations that now we think of in terms of financialization and the rise of derivatives markets and all this kind of crazy complexity a lot of us don't even want to pay attention to. But that's partly what's going on. So behind all this, you could say that what happens to the economy is that it goes from a modern orientation to a postmodern orientation. And by postmodern, it's a very weird word, doesn't always help, because most people, if people think about it in different ways. If you talk to Jordan Peterson, postmodern means the mean, DIE people at the university who don't want you to not say they if people want to say they. That's what postmodern Marxists is what he's talking about. It's not really a good way of thinking about it. Postmodernity isn't just like an idea or a philosophical orientation or some way of talking about literature. It's actually a mutation in capital. And I think that's how it was seen and is how appropriately seen. And what that refers to is a kind of loss of foundation and a sort of cybernetic loop-de-loop that gets kind of a little bit more abstract and more confusing as the farther you go into it. And somewhere along the way, people go, wait, something's kind of shifted. And one of those things that shifted is the kinds of desires and expectations and hopes, mystical dreams, technological dreams that emerge with the creativity of the 1960s become kind of incorporated in a way that ultimately leads to the situation we have today, where we're sort of like anything we pursue, we kind of can tell we're sort of inside of a matrix that's already anticipated our moves, and it becomes very difficult to find any kind of novelty or to sort of feel like we're outside of this kind of loop-de-loop chamber. And you can see the beginnings of that at this time. Let me just So next couple other things about the sort of technological situation. One is that there's also, as this happens, a rise in what you could call surveillance, because as consumers become more sort of dynamic features of the economy, you want to start tracking them in a way. That's what we're doing right now. Our operations and actions as consumers are constantly tracked and fed back to us. There's already science fiction stories in the 1970s about building virtual realities that are designed solely to test out new products and what people are going to want and how to kind of test, consumer desire. It's the emergence of the UPC symbol. That's another one of these symbols that kind of emerges, sort of like the discovery of Nag Hammadi. It's like, yeah, it's just a UPC symbol, but I don't know, in a way, it's almost like a little reminder of kind of what's going on. When the UPC symbol arose, one of my favorite stories about is a lot of Christians saw it and they said, that's it. It's the mark of the beast. That's the one in the book of Revelation, chapter 13. It's like the mark of the beast. You got to have it. You can't buy and sell, which is this wonderful image that in those days when the Christians were kind of trying to be outside of the engines of technological power, they could see that as a sort of satanic thing, whereas I think things have changed quite drastically. But that's another story that we will get to next time. So there's a lot of paranoia also associated with this kind of surveillance move. If Gene Hackman was recently died, everyone was thinking about that. So if you haven't seen the great Gene Hackman movie, The Conversation, I strongly recommend that you see this marvelous piece of cinema shot here in San Francisco, and very much reflecting the sense of surveillance, which is not just a concept in our minds that we're being tracked and pursued. It's a fundamental psychological, and I would even say psycho-spiritual effect, a quality of being watched, of not knowing what's watching you. And Philip K. Dick in the early 70s, talking about surveillance, made the point. He's like, now we've surrounded ourselves with all of these new technologies that are observing us and feeding back our behavior. But in a weird way, it's produced the feeling that we once had being in the jungle or being on the savannah, being surrounded by non-human entities that are tracking us. It adds this kind of edge, this kind of creepiness to the situation, and that's part of the weirdness that is about, because it's real. One other, let's see what time where we got it here. 7:43. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead to our two folks. So what I do in High Weirdness is I set out this kind of picture of the 1970s. One other thing to mention that's very relevant from today is that in the wake of drugs and alternate religion, there's this absolute explosion of opportunities for altered states of consciousness, to use the 70s term. So whether it's through biofeedback devices or curious drugs or encounter groups or tantric sex or plant destruction, is that everybody has the opportunity to explore the fringes of the human mind, and nobody really knows why and what for. And that part of what the fabric of this sort of turn to postmodernity is precisely the opening up of all these different dimensions, and the fundamental question, what do we do with them? How do we integrate them? Are they real? Or can we live there? Or is it going to help? Who knows? But there was this kind of drive and desire to experience on this larger scale that also undermines the kind of conventional ways of pursuing life in the world. So now we bring on our friends Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson. So in High Weirdness, I kind of set up this story, and once again, you can see that the story is both built of actual transformations, historical forces, narratives about historical forces that are pretty well grounded in conventional historical approaches, maybe a little bit of theory over here, but also some of these dream symbols that arise that seem to suggest other dimensions of what's going on. One way of thinking about it is that, and I think this is really true, this is just the way I perceive it, and I perceive it regularly, which can be a bit trying, is that history is kind of constantly throwing up little foreshocks of what's just around the bend. And it's not clear. It's not I have seen the future. It's more like allegories or poems about historical forces that we can't quite articulate or rationalize. And we're sort of stuck reading these signs, which if we go too far, we become paranoid or conspiracy theorists or megalomaniacal messiahs, or just sticking to the facts, and we're kind of missing something about what's actually going on, which has these other levels and other resonances to it. Anyway, so I lay out this kind of territory, and then I say, so what's really interesting about Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson is that in this situation, in this period of time, in the early 1970s, with all this stuff going on, they take huge amounts of drugs, they study really weird stuff, and they have experiences that don't fit into any category. They have experiences that are simultaneously religious, mystical, science fictional, absurd, totally psychotic, fascinating, philosophical, hedonistic. And what do you do with such a thing? Where do you put it? It's a monster. It doesn't go anywhere. And so part of what I talk about is how they go through, how they built the structures to have the experiences they did, why they took the shape that they did, why certain images happen in their stories and things like that. I'm not going to go into the detail, but what I do want to do is just to pull out a few practices. So I want to underscore that these practices, as I'm saying, I'm going to lose my voice. Frustrating. These practices are not just about taking drugs or being a freak. The basic argument I have is that people who take a lot of drugs in this way and go into those zones are in a way making themselves kind of like a live wire that picks up these ambient sociological, cultural, technological, historical forces and sort of transforms them into these living dream texts that have a prophetic quality. And they have a prophetic quality because they look forward to something like we're in now, which I think we can see regardless of how we organize the political situation, on a more like psychological, spiritual level, is it's like we're coming up, we have come up on a weird, hard drug that we're not going to come down from. We're not going to come down from. We might find pockets, we need to find pockets, but it's not stopping. And so looking at these crazy, weird fringe characters is actually not the worst thing in the world, especially when we look at a particular question or a particular practice they had, which was how to look at and engage the very strange, highly weird situation they were in and not lose their minds. And another way of kind of saying this is that I think one of the many ways that our society is not prepared for this is that we don't have a very productive way of thinking and talking about psychopathology, about our own pathologies and the pathologies in others. The way that we mostly handle it is we break it down into these little identifying syndromes. Oh, I have ADHD. I'm bipolar. I was like, blah, blah, blah. And then people self-identify, and then they use it as a form of identification. And we're all doing that as opposed to like the fact that we're kind of all, in some ways, fucking crazy. And what part of being a adult human is like how you manage your craziness, and you do it with others, but you have to take personal responsibility for it. It's very complicated. Sometimes it swallows you up, and you're screwed. We lose people. You know, I've known people who've gone completely paranoid and didn't come back, and so I worked with them. They were close friends, and I just like went in there with them and saw how paranoia works and how it's very true in many ways, and how attractive and magnetic that kind of thing could be. So one thing that's interesting to look at these characters is in a lot of ways, because of who they were, because of what was in their brains, because of the drugs, they lost it, and then they had to find their way back. So one of the ways that that McKenna approaches this is He was very influenced by this article called Shamans and Acute Schizophrenia. And in the old days, mean anthropologists thought of shamans as just being schizophrenics in a kind of negative way. But in the late 60s, where you have kind of nouveau psychiatrists who are coming up with cool new ideas, they're like, no. We have to re-understand what psychosis is. Psychosis isn't necessarily a bad thing. It depends what we do with it. So the argument in this thing, I'm not going to defend the argument, I'm just going to lay it out, is that up to a certain point, the experience of shamans and schizophrenics, that's just the kind of lame word they were using. We could talk about that forever, but let's just go with it. Is actually fairly similar. There's sort of a breakdown of conventional reality construction, an emergence of explosion of primary process that's completely overwhelming, all sorts of magical thinking and like sort of paranoid putting together pieces or whatever. But then in certain societies, they know how to organize that to have it be a shamanic initiatory practice that enables the shaman to come out on the other side and be a productive member of society. Whereas in our world, they just lose it. I'm not going to defend this thing, but it's showing, again, these symptoms that remind you what's going on at the time is an attempt to wrestle with psychosis in a new and even productive way. So Terence picks this up in an interesting way. This is the quote from his 1975 book that he wrote with his brother, The Invisible Landscape. The shaman's psychic life is not unlike the unnaturally dexterous dances he performs at the height of his ecstasy. It is a constant balancing act, as though he or she were a psychic tightrope walker on the razor's edge between the external world and the bizarre, magical, often terrifying world within. Now, what popped out for me from this is this image of the tightrope walker. So imagine the tightrope walker. There you are. You're going out over the abyss. There's no foundation, really. All you have is your internal balance and the way you're able to keep yourself upright by balancing contrary forces. It's actually a very beautiful analogy for a certain way of keeping your sense about you as you enter into a weird situation. This could be a psychedelic trip that was larger than you expected. This could be trying to make your way through the competing narratives of our particular moment. This could be actual experiences of your own psychopathology where things, I'm starting to lose it here. Let's see, how am I going to get through that? Okay, what does it mean to balance? What does it mean to at once lean into your experience and be able to hold back from it? So the tightrope is a site of a kind of, this is another line from High Weirdness, a vertiginous ecstasy and canny expertise. To remain upright, the modern shaman needs to occupy the no longer excluded middle. I'll explain that in a little bit. Balancing between skepticism and credulity, madness and myth, technique and mystique. It requires something like radical empiricism, a keen-eyed engagement with experience whose clarifying tension is maintained by suspending questions of ultimate meaning. So what I'm talking about here is in a way to balance the recognition that the world is now very strange with a kind of skeptical removal or refusal of just embracing the situation. If you just embrace the situation, if you just take the story, you run with it, you get to psychosis, you get to megalomaniacal beliefs, you get to overwhelming confidence in the vision that you've had. And at the same time, you can't really deny that something kind of curious, kind of strange is happening. So there's sort of a relationship to experience that acknowledges how weird things are getting, that it's real in some sense. And yet there's also a refusal or an attempt to sort of keep a certain kind of cool in the midst of the situation. And it's a balancing act. It's not a position. It's not a foundation. It's an act. It's something you constantly kind of have to reperform. So that's a little vague, and I have a couple other ways into this state that I'm trying to talk about, or not a state, a practice. One of them that you might remember from English literature class Kids today won't encounter this anymore, with the destruction of the humanities, is what John Keats called negative capability. And there's a longer story to tell about it, but I just want to read kind of the really takeaway quote, is that negative capability allows its practitioners, and he's really thinking about writers here, particularly Shakespeare, to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So it's being in a situation, almost like being in a dream, where you recognize that there's a lot going on that you can't quite wrap your head around, and you're not going to turn away from it. You're going to acknowledge it. And in fact, your ability to be able to become intimate with the situation is precisely dependent on your refusal from trying to collapse it into a story about what it means or whether it's true or not. All right, so now what do we think now? So, okay, here I am. I'm navigating all these competing narratives about what's going on in a certain situation. I realize I actually don't know. And I realize actually I can't really know. And yet I have to navigate. I have to make a move. I have to take a position. How do I do this? I'm not going to do it by falling back on some concept about what I know, the way reality really works. It doesn't work like that. It's something subtler. But you still have to move. You still have to respond. It's not like you can check out. I mean, at least the way I'm approaching this. So the development of the capacity to be in the midst of not knowing, of mystery, of ambiguity, but you're engaged with the situation. You're not just, oh, I don't know, I don't understand what's going on. That's not what I'm talking about. It's an active not knowing rather than a sort of refusal of making a decision or a kind of confusion. Another way of approaching this idea is the philosophical term epoche, which really articulates something fairly similar. And the idea of epoche, it has a couple of different meanings, but in classical skepticism, what it's saying is basically any non-evident story I have about why something is the way it is, any of them, stories about physics, about causality, about history, about psychology, about how humans work, all that stuff, just concepts. But there's something like an evident logic of experience that doesn't really quite work that way. So what happens if we just suspend all those stories about what's going on and we deal with the situation that we're embedded in, that we're embodied in? Yeah, you can niggle with this philosophically. Oh, wait, how do we divine the line? And those are worthwhile questions to have. But there's still a fundamental sort of release of our conceptual overlays and stories that impede our ability to show up for the world of appearances in all their ambiguity, in their magic, in their terror, in their craziness, in their banal, mere, unspeaking presence. And so the notion of epoche, I think, is a really important way, and you also find it in phenomenology, where the phenomenologists who want to philosophically completely affirm experience as such, what it means to be phenomenologically real-time embedded in sensory and conceptual response to the world. How do I get there and not get caught up in cognitive overlays? Well, there's a practice to that. It's an actual practice. You start to get good at it. You can start to be with the richness and ambiguity of phenomena and not overlay a story on it. And one of the ways they talk about that philosophically is through, again, the epoche, where you just suspend all my stories about why things are the way they are, and I try to engage the world of appearances as such. These techniques are also found, and I'll skip another thing about the tightrope walk, because I want to get to a little bit about Robert Anton Wilson, who kind of goes even farther with this very same approach, which he calls maybe logic. And by maybe logic, he's saying, I don't know, maybe, but can I be rigorous about that? Not just like, again, giving up. It's like, no, there's a way of approaching things where you're not really sure what their ultimate meaning is, and yet you're going to engage them. And in the novel that Robert Wilson and I talk about in High Weirdness, to some hope for a chapter that he wrote with Robert Shea called Illuminatus, extremely important book, very resonant, very prophetic for our particular moment in ways that I won't have time to talk about exactly. There's a really wonderful scene early on, and the book is full of conspiracies. It's full of dodges, of tricks, of mind fucks. It lays out a kind of political story where these sort of renegade anarchists are fighting against the Illuminati, and it's really one of the places where the Illuminati mythos gets really developed once it escapes from right-wing conspiracy theory. And they're kind of, in the midst of these crazy battles. If we want to talk more about the Illuminati, please ask me about it. But early in the novel, in a way, he kind of gives you a little hint about how to deal with all this stuff, where these two cops come to a left-wing magazine office that's been blown up. And they start looking around and they find all these texts about the Illuminati, and they're like actual. He goes through and he presents all the texts in the novel, and some of them are from actual books, some of them are from things he made up, some of them are from pranks they actually pulled in real life that used the Illuminati as a joke. It was a way to fuck with people. So he presents all this weird stuff, and then the cops are trying to weave it together, right? They want to build a story. It's like us. We're trying, we got all this different. Is it true? Is it not? Is it rhetoric? Is it a fact? Is it fake news? Okay, let's try to weave it up. And he describes the method that the cop uses to organize the memos. Goodman first applies his intuition, which is defined as a way of thinking beyond and between the facts, a way of sensing wholes, of seeing that there must be a relationship between fact number one and fact number two, even if no such relationship is visible yet. Sound familiar, right? Sounds a lot like conspiracy theory, but that's what happens when we start to look close at history. You're starting to find, well, these two things seem to be resonating really hard. I can't quite draw, well, but if I do let them connect and then I bring this one, okay, now I'm starting to see how things go together, right? I mean, in a way, it's partly just what thinking is, but it has an extra flavor in this kind of zone. But then Goodman applies a different cognitive tool. After following his gut, he revisits the memos using the conservative and logical side of his personality, rigidly holding back the intuitive functions. That's a perfect example of balancing on the tightrope. You're like, I got to figure out some meaningful pattern of what's going on here, but I don't really trust the way that I put these things together because it's too easy. My biases are too strong. I have a tendency to think too dark about things, and I'm always putting those stories together. So what do? I move forward with this kind of balance. And what's also important about this image of the tightrope or the kind of maybe logic is that it reminds us that we need multiple modes. And that's one of the most significant things that I haven't really mentioned that I bring to you, that we'll talk about more next time, is the, to my mind, absolute requirement to have a pluralistic understanding of the world, of reality, of politics, of people, of ontological domains, and that pluralism's hard because you don't know which is it, this one, is it that one? I got to kind of balance. I got to move. What's the claim? And this one, it's hard, And in that sense, I'm old school in that I'm just kind of a pluralist. It's so boring these days. But in an ontological sense, in a philosophical sense, one of the things it means is that there's no one way in to solve the situation. That it involves invoking multiple modalities: intuition, critical reason, narrative, meditational insight, and trying to juggle them as you move on this wire over an abyss. And it's not relaxing. It's nice to be able to know I'm just a logical person, but we can see where logic takes you, and we'll talk about that next week. I'm really fascinated by the Zizians and rationalism gone amok. I just love it. Let me go. It's 8:05. Let me just take a quick peek. I'm going to skip. There's a whole philosophical thing about maybe logic and Pyrrhonism, but we'll have to leave that. I do want to give you a little bit more from Illuminatus in terms of its kind of prophetic quality. I mentioned that the main conflict in the novel is between these sort of renegade, hippie freak anarchists and the Illuminati. But the Illuminati is it's kind of weird the way he presents it. It's not necessarily the way you might think. Like, what does the Illuminati want? So here's my description of the situation. The Illuminati, which Illuminatus, the book, implies are responsible for the assassinations that devastated liberal and progressive America in the 60s, are also linked to the sorts of extraordinary experiences associated with the counterculture's use of drugs and mysticism, not to mention sex. As such, the novel's black hats are not reactionaries, royalists, Straussian status, or law and order cops, many of whom are actually portrayed by the authors in a reasonably positive, almost Phil Dickian light. So I wrote this in like 2017. Like the anarchist Discordians, the anarchist group who make up their foes, the Illuminati are instead made up of what the novel characterizes as homo neophilis, neophiles, people who love novelty, who shun traditionalism and want to exuberantly accelerate the deterritorializing forces associated with capitalism, technology, and secular modernity. The end result of their neoliberal science is not simply control, but a sort of diabolical transhumanism. So when they wrote the novel in the 1970s, conservatives were conservative. You know, they wanted to like keep things the way they were. They wanted the traditions. They wanted old school Christianity. They wanted to put these freaks back into their lanes, tamp down all these people, all these others who want their own kind of zone, and to sort of restore traditions. But that's not who we have now. We have these guys. We have radical neophiles. So it's super weird, like kind of like, whoa, where do we get that? Like even the drugs, you know, like Elon Musk uses ketamine. What do we do with that? I mean, I don't know how many of you have gone deep into ketamine, but it gets pretty weird, you know? And unlike, I would say, LSD or ayahuasca or mushrooms, that it's a fast track to delusion. I've seen it happen to me. I've seen it happen to other people. Doesn't take that much. You get a story going. The story gets reinforced on the next trip. Oh yeah, I'm really important. I'm helping to save the universe. I mean, I've seen it happen to people. So we're in this situation where one of these sort of Illuminati, neophile, libertarian, right-wing characters is like drugs and altered states as part of, whoa, here we are. One final bit, and then we'll take a break. So the ultimate, the ultimate goal of the Illuminati, as manifested in the rock band, the American Medical Association, the AMA, is to immanentize the eschaton. This is the great phrase from Illuminatus. And the phrase comes from the conservative thinker William F. Buckley Jr., who got it from the conservative historian Eric Voegelin. And it's a wonderful phrase, immanentize the eschaton. That is, bring on the end times. Make them alive and real now, in our world now. And we can all feel that energy. We can all feel that energy, wherever it's coming from. Now, what's interesting, Voegelin thought that the desire to immanentize the eschaton was from left-wingers and crazy religious heretics who believed that the religious goal, was to manifest God's kingdom on earth now. So he was an old school conservative Christian, which meant that he knew that humans were too flawed to ever pull that off, and that they should stay humble, stay in their lane. God would take care of it, and don't have the Promethean presumption that you're going to be able to pull this off, whether you're a Marxist 5-year planner or some kind of mystic revolutionary. It's all bullshit. But again, that's who we're getting now, not the old school conservatives. The ways in which the reactionary Christian right are heading are like, no, we can do this. We can take over the reins of power and enforce our model of reality and bring Christ's kingdom onto earth. So it's really kind of spooky as someone who's reading this book, because it's just in a way, too prophetic. And one little final bit. So they're going to create a mass magical operation that's going to immanentize the eschaton, and they're going to do it at a rock festival. And after a bunch of people die, so they're going to have human sacrifice to bring it on. By harvesting the life energy of the festival fans, they'll be slaughtered with battalions of, yes, Nazi zombies hibernating at the bottom of a lake. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning of the talk. Why are they Nazi zombies? Because we're waking up from a 75-year nap, and we're looking at the big baddie in the room and the people who somehow moved by that nightmare. So next week, we'll take a break now, and we'll come back and do Q&A. We'll say goodbye to the people in internet land. Thank you very much, Christian. I took a few glances. Excellent. Very appreciative. Notice especially the little images popping up. And so, yeah, next week, we'll go more into the contemporary world, and we'll get involved in more practices, more things, more grounded, concrete ways of moving through the situation and not losing our minds. So let's take 5 minutes now to bio break, get some tea, get some water, and we'll come back in for Q&A. A little over the place, but, you know, it's kind of my style.
No, it was clear.
Oh, good.
The board made it